session. Earlier today, the landmark Aridity UNCCD report was launched. This is a comprehensive study prepared by a distinguished group of scientists which reveals a sobering reality. Three-quarters of Earth's land has become permanently drier over the last 3 decades. Today, we are fortunate to hear from 5 of the lead scientists behind this critical report. They will share key findings, provide insights into the challenges facing future generations, and emphasize the urgent need for collective action to safeguard our planet's future. Allow me to introduce our esteemed speakers. Dr. Baron Joseph Orr, Chief Scientist Science, Technology and Innovation, a Mary Crew Fellow. Baron is the lead scientist for the UNCCD and an independent scientist for the UNCCD Science Policy Interface. Professor Nicole Nanette Barger, Science Policy Interface, co-chair and deputy chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy. Professor Sergio Vinet Serrano, scientist and lead author of the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Professor Narcisa Gabriela Pricope, Land Systems Scientist and Associate Vice President for Research in the Office of Research and Economic Development at Mississippi State University. Welcome to each of you, and it's a great honor to have you join this briefing and hear your insight on this critical report. Baron, allow me to start with you. Could you please tell us why both scientists and policymakers expressed the need for the report at this point?
Thank you very much, Azan. This is a very good question because it's not very common where, in parallel, scientists push for more information in a particular area while policymakers are at the same time requesting a need. And how did this come about? Well, first of all, a few years ago, 2019, the IPCC published the special report on climate change and land. And inside that report was a small section that indicated that it was very likely that in parts of all regions, drying was taking place. And it also indicated that the science was not deep, there weren't a lot of publications, and the views were a little bit divergent. So scientists, some at the table, that were serving on the science policy interface for the UNCCD described how it might be important to take a look at this as we were looking at the next work program of the UNCCD. Now let's go to the policy side. As you may be aware, this convention focuses on land degradation and drought for the entire world. But it was created not so long after the horrible famines in Africa that we know about in the 70s and 80s. And therefore, there was a particular concern for dry lands. Desertification is defined as land degradation in dry lands. In other words, the intersection of water scarcity and loss of productivity and biodiversity in land. So that meant that the convention has a very specific thought of, let's take a consideration of those areas, we'll use the aridity index, and we know where they are. And then there was sort of this general assumption that that was relatively static, and nobody really looked at whether that was changing, except in the scientific community. And certainly no intergovernmental organizations or even at national level were incorporating this kind of data into their monitoring systems. It simply was off the table. But in this convention, the recognition that it's very important was there, so they embraced this topic. And I think that's extremely important for what you're going to hear next from my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will now turn to Nicole as co-chair of the Science Policy Interface. How do you translate scientific findings into policy recommendations?
So translating scientific findings into policy recommendations as scientists is incredibly rare. Being on a science policy interface, especially here at UNCCD, it's a critical group of scientists sitting with decision makers, which is actually a rare opportunity for us to understand the inner workings of how policy is made, but also understanding from decision makers and policy makers the challenging nature of doing science and the uncertainties that come with that. So the way that we translate science into decision making is first that we produce technical reports like we're talking about today, that in that aspect we are the knowledge generators. We're generating new knowledge, and in this case about historical and future aridity trends. And as knowledge generators, we are coming to you with new science, but at the same time, during that process, we're developing recommendations and sitting with those policymakers to be increasingly constrained and not being the scientists that we normally are and thinking about, well, we would recommend this. So we have that safeguard sitting in the room with us of policymakers saying, that's not realistic, or we've done this before. So it's an incredibly strong group to be able to sit in the same room and to have these discussions. And so the other important aspect of being knowledge generators, for example, on these reports, is that we go through a robust peer review process. So just because we're a science policy interface group doesn't mean that we don't go through and put ourselves through the same peer review process that is expected for other scientists from academic or research institutions. So for example, on this report, it was authored by 12 experts from around the world, so we have a diversity of viewpoints and expertise from 10 different countries, reviewed by 11 external experts, and in addition to 9 internal reviewers. So this collaborative effort ensures that our work is comprehensive, inclusive, and of the highest scientific standard that then forms the basis of building those policy recommendations.
Fascinating, Nicole, thank you. I will move now to Sergio. Can you give us your perspective on the report with focus on high-level results? And what are the partnerships required to transform the findings into actions?
Okay, thank you very much. Well, in general, this report has developed a very complete assessment of the implications of aridity, not only in terms of the physical aspects related to the mechanism, the recent trends, the role of climate change, but also the future projections. But in addition, he has included a very extensive literature review with more than 400 studies stressing the different impacts of aridity and the existing adaptations to this phenomenon. Well, the report has identified that our heartland is drying. In fact, more than 40% of the current heartland is under dryland conditions, and this is increasing. For example, well, there is an increase of more than 3% of the drylands nowadays in comparison to 30 years ago. We can't explain these trends without considering warming processes. Most of the drying trends have been affected by the greenhouse emissions, so this is the main driver of the current land aridification. And it is important to remark that a high percentage of the total Earth population living now in drylands. We are speaking of about 2.3 billion people, around 30% of the total Earth population. And the percentage of the people that is living there is growing. In 1970, around 20% of the world population was living in drylands, and nowadays it is around 30%. So the drylands are having more and more importance from a socioeconomic perspective. And for the future, the up-to-date models project that, depending on the emission scenarios, will move to a process of aridification that will involve between 7 and 9% more of the Earth's surface in comparison to the current situation. So it is very important that the different institutions, governments at different levels, from the local to the supranational levels, will develop different initiatives in order to improve not only the mitigation of aridification processes, which are well connected with current climate change mitigations, but in addition, different adaptation practices at different levels. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergio. Now I'd like to move on to Narcisa. Can you speak to us a little bit more about the regional and global impacts?
Absolutely. I grew up in Romania, working the fields in eastern Romania, basically my entire childhood. And then I moved to the United States and been studying drylands and processes associated with drylands degradation for the last 18 years. So aridification is very close to me, both personally and professionally. The impacts that we are seeing through the analysis done through this report, as Dr. Vicente Serrano explained, are quite staggering. Not only the people included and affected, but also the regions. What stood out to me the most is that about 95% of the continent of Europe has experienced drying trends over the last 30 years, as evidenced from our findings. Specifically in the Mediterranean region and southeastern Europe, that's where I come from, the breadbasket of Europe. We're seeing the same kinds of impacts in Brazil, in China, in Argentina, in Western United States. Most of these impacts are actually occurring in our breadbaskets or in our mega biodiversity regions of the world. And that is what's actually quite concerning to us. In Central Africa and parts of Asia, again, we have seen that the impacts of aridification and these continued drying trends are affecting GDPs. African nations have lost about 12% of their GDP in the last 15 years because of drying aridity trends. Also, a lot of children have been affected indirectly. Malnutrition and stunting, as you've probably heard of these global health issues, are actually occurring in a lot of the places that are dealing with increased aridity trends most of the time. As 40% of our arable land is being affected by aridity, that definitely has implications for food security, health, and of course, migration. And with that comes our international stability. Higher emissions are linked to higher rates of aridification, which in turn will put everybody more or less at risk. And I could go on, but I will end on the fact that we are showing that about 2/3 of land is actually likely to lose a lot of its water, store less water over the last 30 years. And that is another really important impact that we need to be thinking about and tackling. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a follow-up to you, if you don't mind, but please, if anybody else also would like to comment. A child who was born this year will be 75 years old in 2100, which is the landmark. Can you try to explain to us how the world would look like then?
Well, thank you for that question. I have a almost 3-year-old at home, and she watched me present this report with my colleague, Dr. Vicente Serrano, and my husband captured a photo of her touching me on the TV. And when I saw that photo, I realized that even though we are, as scientists, we are fairly tentative to talk about 2100, we're always talking about uncertainties and trade-offs and complex interactions, but in reality, no matter what scenario we are looking at in terms of aridification, the reality is that the world will be much drier, and it will look a lot more differently about 77 years from now for my child and the children of other people than it does now. And I think that motivates a lot of us to really take action.
I would like to add that oftentimes these questions are critical to be thinking about future generations, but we don't always recognize when we're living in it. So as a scientist working for 2 decades in the Western United States, that is called out in this report as an impacted region, I know from working on the ground that we are seeing in our rangelands changes in species, changes in forage productivity for livestock, that is going to impact ranchers of the Western United States. I talk to ranchers, and they say that over the last several decades, they've seen these shifts on the ground. They're worried about the number of animals that they can also have to be able to support their families and to support their communities. We're seeing an increased wildfire risk, which is also highlighted in the report. So every summer now, I used to look forward to summer in Colorado. I don't look forward to summer in Colorado as much. I know that by July, I will be suffering the effects, along with my family, of the smoke emissions coming from California, Canada, and other parts of the Western United States. So I think it's critical to communicate that we are not always thinking about when we are living in it now, but we are.
Thank you. I have one more before I open the floor. Can you explain to us, any of the scientists are welcome to answer, the difference between aridity and drought?
Yeah, of course. Well, in general, there is a lot of confusion about this. Both terms refer to dry conditions. But drought is a temporary phenomenon that may occur everywhere, both in humid and dry areas. But aridity is basically a permanent long-term conditions that is recorded considering long-term precipitation and atmospheric evaporative demand records. So changes in aridity can be more relevant in terms of adaptation issues, because it is expected that a drought will finish sometime, but the issue of aridity is more tricky, as areas that are converted to dry lands might suffer water deficits in a chronic manner.
Baron, you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that these trends mean that places that currently are not adapted to these dry conditions will be facing these dry conditions, but are not aware that they will be facing these dry conditions, because this has been primarily the domain of scientists. It has not pushed into your earlier question. The World Meteorological Organization has welcomed this report because they realize that this information will now need to be incorporated in their interaction with national meteorological organizations all around the world. You can imagine a city like Los Angeles, just as a simple example, will be able to adjust if it gets a bit drier because they've been adjusting for decades. But cities that aren't that dry are not thinking about this. They're worried about drought, perhaps, but since it's episodic, that is a different form of adaptation than a permanent drying trend. Thank you.
Thank you very much, our speakers. Now we will open the floor to questions from the media. Just a couple of points from me. First of all, if you don't have your questions answered here, there's a big group of scientists that we mentioned who worked on this, and they're all going to make themselves available for your questions, and we appreciate your interest in this and conveying the message. The questions can be asked in English, Arabic, and French, which my colleague Anne will translate from French and myself from Arabic, but the answers will be in English only. However, a recording will be available afterwards. Please, when you ask a question, please state from your name, which media you are from, and if you'd like to address the question of a certain speaker.
Yeah, thank you very much. David Jaggi, representing DEVEX. And my question is, I've seen part of the report mentions about the effect of sun and dust storms on health systems. And from the figures you have given, I see you only mention the effects of sun and dust storms in China and the US. Could you give us, that is on health, could you give us some context on the effects of sun and dust storms on health in Africa?
Well, in general, our assessment has been based on literature review. So it means in some areas, this information is available based on scientific studies. For example, in these cases you have mentioned. And in other areas, well, there is a gap in the knowledge of some of the processes. But in any case, I will assimilate the findings found in some regions to others. Okay, in terms of the effect of the dust and effects of the pollution processes on health. What is important to remark is that aridification causes more wind erosion, okay? Everywhere, in Africa, in Asia, in every arid region of the world. So in these cases, of course, the population can be more affected by problems in their health as a function of these kinds of pollution. Of course, depending on the health system, depending on the socioeconomic conditions, these effects can be more or less serious. But in general, the mechanisms, the health mechanisms, can be very similar independently of the region. Okay?
Okay, please, second row here. Thank you.
Hi, Urmi Goswami from the Economic Times. I have two questions. The first one is, obviously this is subject of negotiations, and I'm wondering how countries have been reacting to your recommendations. And the second one, somewhat related, but now we know that the world's drier than it was, and has gotten drier over the next 30 years. What kind of real policies, I mean, or fiscal policies do you recommend, or are you all recommending, broadly, obviously, country-wise it'll differ, but a general trend that could actually help reverse, arrest this trend? Thank you.
So the actual negotiations are ongoing, so it's hard to judge. They move and they move. But I think one thing's important, and perhaps not always satisfying for journalists is that when something is not on the agenda at all, as is the case of what we are talking about here in this report, there is no magic bullet, right? There is no major ambitious step that countries can propose to themselves because they have no basis upon which to work other than, in this case, a scientific report. So what is not as exciting are incremental, very clear steps that need to be taken. But I'd just like to point out that 10, 15 years ago, there was nothing on the table for land degradation. And now we have trends data from all countries showing the story because they took these incremental steps, and the financing question comes with it. So in the package that they're considering, I've already mentioned it a little bit earlier, there are recommendations that would, number one, sensitize the World Meteorological Organization and the Global Water Partnership towards this so that they can start to incorporate it, even as they already are looking at drought and drought resilience. This permanent trend is not part of the thinking, I mean, in some people, but not structurally in what they're doing. That would be a major step because no one can respond unless they're aware and they have data moving in the right direction, et cetera, to do this. And then the second side of it is that this is an intersection between, I mean, earlier Sergio mentioned the climate drivers, but we also have interaction with land degradation, right? If we have lush vegetation, and then the feedback back and forth between land and atmosphere is one thing, and a very different thing when there's nothing protecting the soils. So there is a very large amount of what we do in climate change adaptation that requires sound land-based solutions. Those solutions are not so different from those that we already are pursuing in the convention. But what could change as a result of these incremental policies is, on one side, in the climate change context, there would be a recognition of aridity in the adaptation process. And on the other side, when we think about land degradation, we so frequently think about now, the current state, but we're not looking at it into the future relative to climate change. This aridity report changes that entirely. It forces us to bring these together. These would be two major steps forward. Then I think the kinds of things that you're referring to related to finance would be there. But I think that what generally happens is organizations, financial organizations like the Global Environment Facility and the Green Climate Fund, they also depend on this science. And when the science is clear, then their evaluation of projects would include whether or not these concerns were addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. We will go to the gentleman there.
Hello, I'm Sami from Pakistan, environmental journalist. I would like to ask Baron, at one side we see things that drought are being happen due to lack of water, but other side we see land is being degraded due to floods. Like in Pakistan, thousands of acres are vanished due to recent floods. And what's your citation about that?
So I think the scientists will frown at part of my answer here, but first of all, in this convention, I mean, we always talk about drought, but our real focus, as you've heard in all of the discussions, is drought resilience. Why? Because we can't control the rainfall. That is another domain in terms of the UN system. Part of that is climate change, part of that is the World Meteorological Organization. But resilience has to do with, by and large, land. Now, what do I mean by that? The two most important categories towards that resilience pushes us into the space, which is what you really are touching on, which is water scarcity. So the rain has fallen, but where is it? And is it available to us or not? Did it evaporate? Or have we actually implemented measures, which are the kinds of measures in the report that we're talking about for adaptation, that would actually result in more of that water being retained? Now, immediately we think about, rooftops that capture water. We always think urban, but the major water user is agriculture. So the first question is, are we planting thirsty crops? And if we're not, do we have the policies to move us towards arid-adapted crops? And the second side of it is, as you all know, we're talking about somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 6 hectares that we converted for agriculture can no longer be used for agriculture. Well, all of those soils, and I would also put to you, many of the soils that are currently being farmed are through very old style practices that are so dependent on chemical fertilizer that the biological factories of the soils are shut down. They are circumvented. It's a great thing because the crops can bring up the nutrients they need immediately, right? But it shuts down all the natural conversion of dead plant matter, right, that was left in the field that would normally provide those nutrients. Well, it turns out that that same organic matter is what gives the soils water holding capacity. We call it more crop per drop. So in 2 areas, we could make a huge impact on adjusting to these trends that are, we can talk about all the others that are urban related that we hear about more, but those 2 areas will be fundamental for many, many parts of the world in dealing with these challenges. Thanks.
Thank you. Please, second row.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Daniela Chiaretti from Brazil, Valor Econômico, which is, we are going through a terrible season of droughts and the rivers in the Amazon. Well, you know that. I have 2 questions. One is about this discussion, this political discussion. They are stuck for years discussing if the drought are a local thing or a global thing. Can I say that this report is showing that it's a global problem, first thing? Second thing, it's about the elephant in the room. What are you suggesting for the oil production and fossil fuel burning? And if I may, the third thing, what are you saying for the big producers of soya, for instance, in Brazil, that are this framework you're building, Professor Ho, is not for them? Thank you.
Well, probably the Amazon region is nowadays one of the main regions affected by droughts in the world. For example, the drought that affected the Amazon in 2023, that extends to now, has been, I would say, unprecedented in terms of, well, not only in terms of the water availability, also in terms of the associated heat waves that affected Brazil in 2023 with anomalies higher than 4 degrees in temperature. This is what is expected more and more for the future, because not only our land can be drier, but it produces some feedbacks. So if evaporation is constrained given soil water availability, given reduced precipitation, the atmosphere, the air in contact with the land, is warmer, because the refreshing effect of evaporation disappears. So this is a very, very important point that, well, not only we are moving to drier conditions in general, but we expect that associated to these more arid conditions, the severity of drought events, these temporary anomalies in the water availability, will be more and more severe, like observed in Amazon, not only in 2023. This is already a frequent phenomenon that Brazil is suffering in the last 2 decades.
So I'll follow with the other two parts. I just wanted to emphasize the earlier explanation about the difference between drought and aridity when you capture this, because I think that's very important. They're two different elements, and I wanted to make sure you didn't get them conflated there. So in terms of one of the primary foci in the negotiations where something very big is they're grappling with something very big, is actually, I would characterize it a little bit differently than the way you did, which is whether they're looking at an approach that is more local or global. Actually, these policymakers always want both. They never want something that only is useful national to global. They're constantly talking about how do we make it relevant nationally to locally. It's part of it. What they're really struggling with is how. What is the best mechanism to really address this? And there are different views in different parts of the world and even in different countries. So that is the big discussion I think that you were referring to. It's not about scale of approach. It's much more about the mechanism. What kind of global mechanism, what kind of financial mechanism at this higher level do we need to do to give, in this case, the drought issue, the full attention that it needs to be addressed. And I don't know how that's going, but it can't be easy, right? I mean, every time you try to take on the whole thing in one go, it's challenging. With respect to the elephant in the room, it's always discussed. And what's interesting in not only this report, but also in the other science policy interface report, which is on sustainable land use systems, is that while we always refer to emissions that are coming from factories and cars and all of that as something that cannot be ignored, so when these scientists refer to climate change and the solutions, they never ignore that emissions must be addressed. That's for sure. But what has been really strongly pointed out in these reports is that even if you did that and addressed it fully, we will fail. Because the ship that we are upon, what's below your feet that you think is carpet, is actually soil, is actually land. And that is no longer healthy. That is no longer trending towards being the solution, the carbon sink, the place for biodiversity. We're damaging all of that, and in the process, accelerating emissions. It's a very large chunk of emissions that comes from land. So I mean, we don't talk about it as much, but it is there. And then to finish, this particular intergovernmental process is very focused on land. It doesn't delve into the other because other experts are already in that space and working. It's not ignored, but it's not central. So in this case, it isn't the elephant in the room, it's the elephant that's there that is fully acknowledged, but simply not part of the of the policy agenda. So it is considered, it's always referenced in these reports, but it's not the thing that's being addressed. What we really are trying to get attention on is the thing that we don't think about. So much of the global population now, I think half, is more urbanized. So many of our children think that the food that we eat comes from a grocery store and not a farm. Do you see what I mean? There's a very big disconnect. And it's much harder. We don't have a polar bear sitting on an iceberg, right? We have soil, we have grass, we have trees, we have things that are not easy to think about except as to observe in nature. But what we're trying to get people to realize is that all land is at risk here, including where we grow food. In the future, it intersects the demand for food, the need for nature for many other benefits and ecosystem services. All of this is under pressure. And if we get it right, if we bring land back into balance, we have a chance of bringing our food, our energy, our climate, our water, all of that can be brought into balance. And I would put it to you that if we don't get it right with land, it would be the same thing as if we really considered this a ship and we ignored the leaks down below and let it sink. That's where we're headed right now. Thanks.
Thank you very much. This is all we have time for. Thank you so much for our speakers. Please, if as you read more and more into the report and as new questions come up, reach out to us. We have a great panel of scientists who are happy to answer your questions. As you've explained to me, they're really representatives of all parts of the world. Before we finish, I'm going to invite my brilliant colleague, China Gabriel, who will talk us through tomorrow's agenda. We hope, and our speakers, you're very welcome to stay, but I know you might have to run to other meetings. Thank you so much for your time. It was very, very insightful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank all of you for your interest.
So picking up from what Dr. Baron Orr touched upon earlier, the convention stresses resilience. Thus, tomorrow is Resilience Day at COP16, which focuses on building resilience against threats on land through proactive approaches and innovation. At 9 a.m., we have the opening session, Resilience to Address the Challenges of Land Degradation, Desertification, Drought, and Water Scarcity at Meeting Room 33. Following these from 10 a.m. onwards are sessions on scaling up land restoration for resilient ecosystems and communities, resilience through early warning systems, and a session on drought preparedness and water security. On the action agenda, we have the International Drought Resilience Observatory Expert Exchange from 1:30 to 2:30 at Met 33. And this culminates with a closing session on connecting DLDD, SDS, and water scarcity with integrated land solutions at 5:30 p.m. at Met 33. Resilience Day brings together state actors, business leaders, and members of civil society to explore solutions that protect vulnerable populations, restore degraded lands, and support resilient communities. Thus, for relevant press events, we invite you to the Voice of Civil Society Organizations press conference, CSOs at the Heart of the Fight Against Desertification, which is happening tomorrow from 11 to 11:30, also here in this press conference room. For more information on the daily press briefing for journalists on COP16 tomorrow is all to follow. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, China, and thank you all for attending. See you in the next one.